My father said something very interesting about filmmaking. He was a director. But he said if you divide filmmaking into three parts, the preparation of the script, the casting, and all of the things that go before. The second being the shooting of the film, the directing of the actors and the actual shooting of the film. And the third being the editing, all the post-production, and the publicity and the release of the film. He said, if you put a gun to my head and said you have to give up one of those three functions, he said, I'd give up the directing. He said, but if the script is right and they shoot some film and I can get in the editing room with it, I can make it work.
In Hollywood, a new high for glamour is reached as Warner Brothers premieres George Stevens' production, Giant, based on a novel by Edna Ferber. An unprecedented turnout of more than 2,000 screen celebrities, other noted personalities, and press representatives arrive at the famed Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. Three great star names in Giant: Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, James Dean. And here in the forecourt of the theater are the footprints and handprints of Giant stars and producer-director George Stevens.
George always tried to do stories with great conscience. Place in the Sun was a tremendous moral story. Shane was a wonderful, wonderful film.
He was a distinctly American director, and he had a sense of the country and a sense of the land, and so I think Giant was very important to him.
George Stevens, as a director, was 10 plus. As a human being, he was very special, and he was also a 10 or a 10 plus.
George was wonderful with actors. He was tough on crew. He could be tough on crew because he was a perfectionist, and he demanded a lot. But with actors, he just had a wonderful kind of camaraderie. He had a way of becoming whatever your character was, you know, when he talked to you.
I asked a lot of people who had worked with him, what's it like to work with him? And they all, to one, said, just make yourself a piece of putty and put yourself in his hands, and he'll do it all.
He was also had great skill at working in the editing room to help actors in terms of performances, as it were, protecting them by choosing the right takes, by maybe not being on their face on a scene that they're having trouble with at a certain part of it.
He would go to great pains to go all the way around, over this way and that way, to make me think it's my idea, so that I would come up to him and say, George, I have a good idea for this scene. He'd say, what's that, Rob? And I'd tell him and say, yes, that's a good idea. And it was his all along. And he caught me every time. Every time. But it was really true that what everybody said, make yourself a piece of putty and put yourself in his hands and rely on him.
You know, I was in a very good position when the Giant proposal came up because, as I said, I had just starred on Broadway. I'd gotten wonderful reviews. I was getting starring parts on television shows. But I was a little bit scared of movies. And I had several other offers, but I decided I'd rather take it a little easy. I'd rather have a part that didn't have to carry the film, and in which I had a great director, a great master to guide me through.
I walked in the door and I said, now this is what he said, because I don't use this language. He said, well, Jane, you're going to make a hell of a Vashti Snythe. And I said, I beg your pardon? He said, you're going to be Vashti Snythe and Giant. I said, oh, my land alive. I said, no, Mr. Stevens. When I said I wanted to share thoughts with you, I meant about the book and the different characters. He said, well, you'll get a good chance to find out because we're going to be on the picture for quite a while, you know. And I said, oh, no, I'm a mama now and I take care of 3 kids and I haven't worked in a long time. He said, well, we're going to have to do something about changing that.
You know, it's an interesting story how he came to this cast, and I don't know, all of the details because I was apart from it when the casting was going on. I mean, I know that he talked with Audrey Hepburn. I understand he talked with Grace Kelly. There was talk of Bill Holden. And why those didn't work out or whether they did, those two parts were very sought after parts. But what I think is fascinating about the film, when you think of it, is that he chose to go forward with Rock Hudson, who was 28, Elizabeth Taylor, who was 23, and James Dean, who was 23, to play a story that covers 30 years.
I was, let's see, 1955, I was 29, I think. 29, yeah. And I had to be, in the movie, I had to be in the young 20s, 23, 24, 25. And then middle age, I guess 45 to 50. And then older age, I guess 65 to 70, about. Incidentally, I don't know if I had told you this, a couple of years ago, I was in Chicago, and Giant was being run on television late at night, and I just come back from the theater. And I don't like to watch films on television, particularly those that I am involved with. But I was curious, and so I knew when I would be the 45 to 50-year-old age, about what time. I tuned it in to look, and I looked at myself and ran to the mirror and looked in the mirror, and it was exactly the same, including where the gray is, where most of the gray is. To a T, it was exactly. So now I know what I'm going to look like when I'm 70.
It used to be in Hollywood that they would take mature actors, and when they had to shoot the young parts, make them up to look young and give them special lighting, special lenses, and so forth. And George had the idea to take young people because Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, Jimmy Dean were all in their 20s. And to, as the film progressed, to age them. So that was kind of a revolutionary thing to do.
One of the characteristics that marked my father was a tremendous self-confidence in terms of making films.
In getting from Los Angeles to the location of Giant in Marfa, Texas, we went on this one splendiferous train, a big long train with everybody on it. And it was an incredibly fun and interesting event just to get there because there were so many of us.
Well, of course, we had Elizabeth Taylor playing, and who was 24 years old at the time. And I must say that I was, besides becoming really a friend, I mean, she was such a sweetheart. I had such great respect for her, for what she did in that movie. Here's a 24-year-old young actress playing, you know, at the end of the movie, so believably, that older Leslie Benedict. She was wonderful.
So it was at the very beginning of the film. And the night before, Elizabeth very nicely had asked my future wife and I to come over to she and Michael Wilding's house for dinner. Have an evening of getting acquainted, and it's going to be a long time together and so forth. So it was very nice and very polite of her to do so. And we did. And we had a wonderful time. And it was a very liquid evening. And several martinis later, suddenly realize it's 3 in the morning. And we have to get up and go to work and shoot this wedding scene. Well, Elizabeth had to get up, I guess, at 5:30. Girls don't have it as lucky as guys do. I had to get up around 6:30 or something. But we both were so dreadfully hungover. And we had to shoot this scene, this highly emotional scene, and not a word to each other, but just look at each other, just moony-faced. And we shot the scene and the sequence, and the hairdressers and the wardrobe girls and everybody were over there crying and carrying on. And the truth is, we were just so hungover that we couldn't do anything but just look.
My father made A Place in the Sun, which was the first really mature role that Elizabeth played, and that was a wonderful experience. And of course, it was a great film and a great role for her. And so when Giant came along, I think he knew that he'd been to the well with her, and thought that she would be good for this part. And she really did. She did a wonderful job. She, like Rock, she had to age 25 or 30 years and go into territory that she hadn't been before.
I got some great pictures of Elizabeth. When one of my favorite one is in the movie film, but I have some wonderful black and white. She was always saying, for me, clowning, saying, "Oh, darling," and I have a lot of "oh, darlings" of Elizabeth that I just love in different outfits as she grew older through the years in the film.
I think Elizabeth was so wonderful for the part because one of the things that she does best is this haughty rich girl. And to see this lush green country that she came from in Virginia, where she rode horses and she was the queen, and then to see this flower from the east taken into the stark Texas countryside where there was nothing but dust and sagebrush and so forth. It was a wonderful, wonderful contrast. And I think she had some marvelous scenes that she did very, very well. Although I feel that as an actress, Elizabeth really came into her own a little bit later. It was a question of her, too, not quite having the confidence. People used to say to her, well, use your hands more, move a little more. And she didn't quite have the confidence to do that. She had had that MGM training where nothing moves, where you're just beautiful, but you're very, very still.
There was Elizabeth and there was Rock. I think Rock felt that was the best work he'd ever done, by far.
I loved Rock Hudson. I loved him as a person. He was a delicious human being, kind, thoughtful, conscientious about his fellow workers. I used to visit the set occasionally when he was working. And I knew Rock, not well, I always liked him, but I thought, thank you God, he's finally getting the opportunity to share the talent he's always had, but never had the proper words or script or lyrics to share with the public to show them what he's really capable of doing. I thank God that George Stevens saw that in him and gave him that chance, because I think it's the best film he ever did.
I loved him. I followed him around like a puppy. I would worship that man. And so I saw perhaps a little more than maybe other people did.
He was handsome and sensuous and marvelous as the young man. And then I thought he really excelled as the elder man. I thought he did a wonderful job. He was inspired by the part, inspired by George Stevens. I thought he did a wonderful job.
Toward the end of the movie, when he had to wear the extra weight and the padding and everything showed in the long underwear things, but he'd do the Charleston and everything just for my home movies, which was very different than his character on screen as Big Benedict, whom he played in Giant.
Rock Hudson was 28 years old and hadn't played very demanding roles. It was early in his career. And here he had to age from 28 to 58. And toward the end of the picture, of course, they would build him up in here with, padding and make him heavier and some gray in the hair. But there's a scene where he has an argument with Dennis Hopper late in the film. And I was on the set the day they did it here at the studio. And Dad had asked Rock to look at some Spencer Tracy pictures to get a feeling of how an actor, thinking that, that Tracy had a quality of an older man that would be useful to Rock. And he and Dennis took this scene, and it's a scene where they have an argument. And they rehearsed it, they walked around. Dad would always just kind of go in the set and let them do it. He wouldn't say, you stand there, you sit here. And they were going around having at it. And they did it for a little while. Dad used to say that he liked to let actors rehearse and run through things for a while until they felt the need for a little assistance, rather than coming in and saying, here's the way you do it. And he said to Rock, I'd like you to sit in that chair. And Rock went over and sat in this kind of straight, small chair. And then they did the scene. And Rock, played the scene, and then he got out of the chair when it got heated. Dad said, cut. He said, Rock, I want you to stay in that chair the entire scene. And it was such a wonderful thing because you see that scene, Rock is sitting in that chair, and he is an old man, and the young boy has the vitality. And it was just one touch that made that scene work for Rock. And that's an example of how a director can help an actor.
I don't know how other actors felt, but I loved working with George. It was terrific. When we sat down to do the scene with Rock, when he called me into Rock Hudson's dressing room, and he was giving Rock liquor. It was about 9 in the morning, and he was going to do the scene all day long where Rock was kind of in his cups, or Bick was in his cups, and I remember he was giving him shots, getting old Bick into the mood, and he begins to talk. He says, "I wonder what this old son of a bitch wants." This is George talking. This old son of a bitch. I kept thinking, was it? And I realized he was being Bob Dace. What does this old son of a bitch want? This is the way he was giving me his direction. He suddenly became Bob Dace.
There was only one scene that I was in with Jimmy, when Rock and Elizabeth, when he had discovered oil and came barreling up in his truck and had oil all over him. And they really had to plan it just like a dance routine. They had to do the choreography of the scene and how it was going to go. And it took a great deal of time in planning that scene. It was a very important scene in the film, one of the most important, really. But it was the only time, basically, the whole ensemble of the cast were together. But Rock and Jimmy, I have pictures that I took of them that I'm very proud of, because Rock always had this great sense of humor and fun, and he was always that way. And Jimmy was very, very stern and very concentrating on what he was doing, which was understandable. And I think they could have been real special friends if they'd had the time to be.
The only one who was unhappy about his aging was Jimmy. It wasn't that he minded aging. He didn't feel that he accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. He felt that he sort of let those scenes down in which he was an older man. As a matter of fact, in the scene where we see him drunk and destroyed in the ballroom, he was very unhappy with that scene and asked George if he could shoot it over and over and over again. My uncle, Chill Wills, and I were standing at a partially open door and watching this, and this was a big thing for Luz to see kind of the demise of her hero. Jimmy, in the rushes, came up to George Stevens and said, he said, "I wish that you would cut me out of that scene as much as possible, because everything that there is to say is on Carol Baker's face." And that was a lovely thing to say. So he did appreciate other actors, other artists.
In the beginning, I was naturally very interested in Jimmy as an actor and as a person. I'd never, ever met him. And he stayed very much to himself and was very, very distant. So I thought, okay, I will respect that and his privacy. So I stayed very distant. But he was the only one I did, because everybody else were like teddy bears, and I love teddy bears. So it took a while for us to finally kind of share thoughts, but he didn't allow that. If I would just say even good morning, he'd say hi, and with sort of the roll of the eyes and so on, but nothing in the way of communication. So finally, I was taking pictures, as I usually do, of everybody and having a wonderful time. And so finally he came up to me one day and he said, "You don't take any pictures of me." And I said, "Well, I wouldn't think of it." I said, "You obviously enjoy being by yourself because you never come around and mingle with us, especially me." And I said, "I try very hard to respect people's wishes as best I can." And I said, "I wouldn't dream of bothering you in any way, shape, or form." He said, "Well, that's all right." He said, if you want to take some pictures of me, I don't mind." I said, Honest engine, that'd be super. I'd love that. So that was the beginning. That was the first step. And the steps came more regularly and more often.
Interesting. Jimmy told me a story about how he had a big thing about means justifying, I mean, the end justifying the means, you know. But he also told me a story about how one day when he was driving in the hot desert, and that during, you know, this hot summer in Texas, and it gets really hot, on those old blacktop highways, and he came upon a wreck. There'd been an accident, and a man had been injured, a black man, who was lying out on the side of the highway in this hot, boiling Texas sun. And it took an hour, a good hour, for them to get an ambulance there to help him, and the man was hurt. And Jimmy stood over him and afforded him shade for that hour, you know, so that we could shade his face so he wouldn't be lying in that boiling sun. And he was very touched by the fact that the church, the preacher, the minister, had spoken about that, about his humanity, you know, about stopping on the side of a road to help somebody. And he was very touched by the fact that that they had talked about it in church.
I couldn't believe all that he went through when he was, before he did a scene. You know, he'd limber up his shoulders and shake his fingers, and I'd look at him in awe. Finally one day I thought, I gotta find out what all that's about. So I went up and I said, Jimmy, will you answer a question for me? And he said, sure, what is it? I said, why do you do all of this and you bend over and you limber up your shoulders or whatever you're doing? He said, to get in the mood. I said, to get in the mood for what? He said, for what I'm supposed to do. I said, oh. He said, you never do anything. And I said, oh, you've noticed that. I said, well, I've never seen anything like what you've done ever before. Is this part of method acting? I said, I'm sorry, I've never had any acting lessons in my life, and I just do what my heart tells me, and I don't know any other way to do it. And I try to think about what character I'm supposed to be and what that person would think of in the characterization, and try my best to do it. And he said, oh, that's a good idea.
Jimmy was just finding his own as a star, and I think he had a little bit of a complex. He kind of made fun of Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson because, you know, they didn't come from the actor's studio. They weren't, as in his opinion, you know, the great white hope of Broadway or anything that he might have been. So there was some jealousy there, and I think he was although he was treated equally in every way, I think he was always too concerned about whether he was being given equal treatment to everybody else. And yet, I found with George that he was just as kind to the smallest parts, to wonderful small parts like Saul Mineo, who was an adorable, wonderful actor, and Earl Holliman, who was doing one of his first films. So George was kind and good to everybody, and I think he really treated us all as equals. Now, the one thing that George did is that he wanted to have his actors ready and on set at all times. I certainly didn't resent it. I can't imagine that many of the other actors did, but I think Jimmy resented it. I think Jimmy thought, oh, he doesn't think I'm important enough. So therefore, you know, he calls me all the time when I'm not needed. But actually, George just did that with everyone.
Dad had his way of working, which was to take his time. Jimmy was a young man in a hurry, and I think he got impatient with the pace of things. But Dad always cared about the result, and Jimmy brought a great deal to that role, a kind of imagination, and he was a very hard-working actor. I mean, he figured things out, and he worked with his little rope, and he worked at his wardrobe, and I don't think it ever crossed Dad's mind that Jimmy Dean wasn't the right person for that part. And I think he gave kind of a great edge and excitement to the film in the way he played it.
Carol Baker is a very unique lady now, and she was a very unique young lady then when we made Giant.
Well, when I first showed up on the Warner Brothers lot, first of all, I came from New York. It was going to be my first film. Warner Brothers was going to put me under contract, and they sent me the ticket. They put me up in a hotel on Hollywood Boulevard. I arrived at the gate, and I gave my name, and the guard wouldn't let me in, never heard of me. There I saw, a few minutes later, Jimmy Dean come up on his motorcycle. Interesting, because I guess a lot of people are on motorcycles these days, but it was kind of a big, exciting thing for somebody to be on motorcycle then. And he put me on the back and drove me around the lot, showed me the lot.
My father was a man of the West, raised in San Francisco. His parents had been actors in the theater at the turn of the century. And as a young man, he went out into Montana and Utah at first as a camera loader, then an assistant cameraman. And he actually lived with Westerners, cowboys, who were still dated back to that period. And he always had a great feeling for the West. And in his films, he went to tremendous lengths for authenticity, that the clothes looked real. He never liked to call, they refer to the costume department. He always called them clothes. And if you look at James Dean, Jet Rinks, the clothes he wears, they're clothes he's lived in, and they're the sweat and the band of the hat and the dirt. Dad would always say that a man like this only has 2 shirts, and so those shirts would be worn and stained and look lived in.
When you take a Hollywood company into a town, a small town, they can be very put off by that company, but not this, not Marfa. The first night, they said, "You want to go see the Rushes?" So I said, "Sure." And we went to the old theater that's no longer there, I understand, it's burned down. This old theater, and they were running hours and hours of the barbecue. And of course, they had used all these people from Marfa in the barbecue as extras. And they had just, it seemed forever, so much footage of just cattle and Elizabeth and Rock sitting on their horses watching cattle. But it seemed to me the entire town had turned out and was sitting in that theater. It was packed, you couldn't get a seat. I mean, that was so smart of George to do that, because he made the town feel like they were really in on the joke, that they were a part of this movie.
Rock had a great sense of humor, and he was warm and wonderful to be around. And there was a party in his house every night, which was terrific. And we all used to say, "Well, where's Elizabeth? Where's Jimmy?" And of course, they were out talking. I don't really think that there was a romance of any kind there. I really don't. But I think it was his way of saying, "Hey, Rock, I can take Elizabeth away from you. I'm the 3rd character in the film, and just like in the film, she's yours. Well, off screen, she's not yours. She has my attention."
When he decided that Jimmy would play the part, and they sat down to talk about it, Dad talked to him about his race car. And he said, "Look," he said, "I know you love driving." He said, "We've got a lot of people involved in this picture. And if something happens to you and you break your arm or break a leg, there are going to be 300 people, their work's going to be stopped. So I want to ask you, while this picture's being made, not to drive that car." And Jimmy looked at him and said, "All right." And throughout the shooting, Jimmy never drove the car.
When Jimmy Dean died, we got word. We were all in the projection room watching dailies. And somebody came blubbering in and said, "Jimmy just got killed." And George left. And I followed him. And we walked down through the sound stages, through Warner Brothers lot. And I lost him. I couldn't find him. I don't know where he went. Why? where he was going, except to guess that he just wanted to be by himself.
And then I saw Mr. Stevens, and I've never seen him look that way before, never. And I knew something was very wrong. I just felt it so. It's just like somebody stuck a knife in my heart. And thought, oh, please, God, I hope it's not what I'm afraid it is, because we all knew he was going in the race. And I prayed so hard, and I saw him the day before the race. He brought me his pink shirt and said, would you keep this for me till I get back? I said, of course I will. And but I had the strangest feeling when he left, and I'll never be able to explain it or put it into words, but I just was so afraid I'd never see him again.